Hi, it's Pastor Eric back with the virtual text study we're trying at Christ the Servant Lutheran Church. We're calling it Moving Towards Sunday. It's a way that we can take some of the time before Sunday, walking through the lessons we'll use this coming weekend. This is going to be the sixth Sunday of the season of Easter on May 17th. And the reading that comes from the Apostles that we'll use this Sunday, our second reading, is from Peter's first letter to the churches in the third chapter, today verses 13 through 22. I wish I had the technical ability to have the text screen over the flow through the screen while I'm reading it, and someday I may learn how, but you might want to, if you have one, pause this and grab a Bible. It's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 13. Peter writes, "Who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for what is doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. But in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear, so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins, once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him." Here ends the reading. Well, what do you hear in that? It's from a different time and place. It's from that early generation of the church where they found themselves experiencing so many things. The fact that God was speaking to God's people in new and fresh ways, that Jesus coming and walking amongst us, it was indeed God's commitment to us. It was God's statement of saying that my covenant, my commitment is to you is so eternal that I will come and be one of you. I'll squeeze into your form of being and become a human being. It will be a testimony that my love and my commitment to you will never be taken away. They experienced all of that, but it threw into disarray some of the traditions that they'd grown up with. And so Peter found himself, and the early Christians found themselves, no longer welcome in the places that were home as they grew up, no longer welcome in the synagogues, no longer welcome in the community, and it took root and spread further. Their insistence on saying that Jesus was this presence of God who came amongst us, it also made it so that now even amongst the Roman and the Greek communities, they found themselves no longer welcome because they weren't no longer bending their traditions. They were no longer making room just to go along with whatever society was. So that early Christian community, they found themselves stretched and pushed. So much so that it is almost amusing that in verse 13, Peter begins with a question. Who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? Well, many people will harm them. Many people did. You wouldn't think so. You wouldn't think that if you're eager to do what is good, anyone would harm you. But it was the experience of the early church. continues to be the experience today of those who want to stand and to do not just what is acceptable, but what is good. But Peter turns the conversation in verse 14. He uses the great word, but. Even if you do suffer for doing what is right. Even if you do suffer for doing what is right. The word in Greek is interesting. The word is pasiote dia dikaiosune. If you suffer, paskudotune. The Greek word is, it's from which we get the word passion, which originally meant suffering. If you feel passionate about something, if you're moved, if you suffer, if you are changed by what you feel through dikaiosune, Peter uses this word righteousness, which is sort of like the concept in the Old Testament of zedek, of righteousness, was interpreted to me once by one of my professors. He said when he was in Israel and he had his car repaired, the mechanic said to him, now your car is zedek, it's righteous, it's doing what it should do, it's running the way it should, the way it's made. If you are passionate about being the way you should be, about being how you are made, even if you suffer for that, you are blessed. Just as Jesus talked about, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the pure in heart. If you have a passion for doing what is right and the world pushes at you because of it, you are blessed. You are a sign and a testimony of what God's presence and will is like for our world. Peter continues and says, even if you suffer for what is doing right, do not fear what they fear. What is it that the world may be fearing that Peter's thinking about? What do people fear about? What other people think about them? About their position in society? About their security? Do not fear what they fear. And do not be intimidated. Instead, in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. The word sanctify, is outstanding. Hagiasate. The word we get the word hagios in Greek, which means holy, to be set apart. And I think of it as our cousins in the Jewish community will prepare for Passover. One of the things that they'll do is clean out the house of anything that doesn't belong, of anything that's not pure, that's anything that's leaven, anything that shouldn't be there. Sanctify your hearts. Clean out of your hearts anything that shouldn't be there, but instead make place for Christ to be revered, to be holy, to be welcome. It's great language. Sanctify Christ as Lord and be ready to talk about what it is that you believe. In verse 15, be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands for you an accounting of the hope that is in you. But that exhortation to know what you believe and to be able to speak about it, it's couched so excellently in verse 16 with what Peter says to the community. Be ready to speak about what it is that you believe. Be ready to speak about how you make space in your heart for Christ to be the Lord, but do it not with brutality and intimidation and with force. He says, do it with gentleness and reverence. With gentleness and reverence. To love kindness, to do justice, and to walk humbly with our God. Almost as if Peter is reinforcing that idea that just our words alone are not going to be able to change what someone else believes or thinks or feels. The force of argument cannot be used as a tyranny to change what someone feels, but God can. And it seems as though Peter is talking about how if with gentleness and reverence. We're eager to feel and do those things that are righteous. Excuse me. That God will work within our hearts and change how people think. He continues and says that if in fact we do suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, if somehow in the mystery of God's economy and timing and plan, part of our purpose is to be there to be an example of what God's will looks like in this world rather than what might be the trend these days. If it's God's purpose, God's will for us to suffer, it's better to do so for doing God's will than for doing evil. And then Peter turns and begins to reach into his tradition, and he begins to speak about all of these things which he's both experienced in Jesus and which he grew up hearing. He talks about Jesus, who also suffered. He suffered once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, was put to death on that cross, but made alive, in fact, so much so that we get that passage in verse 19 that explains why we, every week in the creeds, will talk about Jesus who descended to the dead. Peter talks about that, saying in some way of mystery and spirit that in that time when Jesus was in the grave, in the tomb, that he went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison. What would he have said? What might that preaching have been like? You wonder what Jesus would have said as he spoke with Abraham, with Moses, with Elijah, with all of the people who'd gone before, and spoke about how the fullness of God's purpose was to come as one of us, and to make a statement saying that it's not a matter of your own cleverness that makes you at peace with God, but God's coming to us and giving God's self and committing God's self to us. He finishes out the passage by talking about how God had in the past been patient and with Noah was patient with those who were saved, 8 persons saved through water, using that story of Noah to talk about how baptism. Peter choosing to use words that are a different way of looking at what we've heard baptism to mean in the New Testament again. Paul will talk in Romans 6 particularly, 6:1 on, talk about baptism as a death and a resurrection, that we're plunged into the death of Jesus and we're pulled forth into a new life that begins now and that we walk further and further into, that God continues to nourish. All through Romans 6 and 7 and 8, it speaks about how this baptism is transformative to us and continues to be a process in a way. It's both something that's actually happened completely and yet we grow into throughout life in this world. But Peter talks about it differently. He uses a whole different image. He says in verse 21 that baptism, which all of that story of Noah prefigured, it now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body. He interestingly uses this phrase, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. Conscience, the word in Greek, is so interesting. It's a combination of 2 words, sun with and ideo, to see, to perceive, to understand. In essence, like the conscience is being able to see what is within you and to ask in baptism that what we see within us will be something that's good because God changes us. Baptism, which saves you as an appeal to God for a good conscience through this resurrection of Jesus, who's gone to heaven, and it continues in the words of the creed that we use, and is at the right hand of God with angels and authorities and powers made subject to him. Peter's words were meant to be a strong word of encouragement to that first generation of the Christians who were finding themselves ecstatic over what they were hearing about God in Christ Jesus, and yet finding that there was so much resistance and push from their faith traditions and the community in which they lived. And Peter is saying to those first generation of Christians, maybe to us this day as well, that if you suffer for what is in God's will, that you're blessed, and that God is able to use that as a witness to change and to bring a sign of God's presence and God's reign in this time and place. How would you preach this? If you were to use this text as a passage for a sermon this May 17th, I might be tempted to take the first question that Peter begins with. Who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? And just pose the question. Is someone going to harm you if your intention is to do good? And to raise before the community the tragedy of Ahmaud Arbery's murder in Georgia. A young man who was simply jogging, offending no one. And the tyranny of racism, of suspicion, of anger comes up. Two white men who had not yet had that transformation of the gospel reach to the most important places of their heart. Chase the man down and take his life. What will come of that innocent suffering and death? I might use the sermon to speak about how God perhaps can use Ahmaud's death as another occasion for us to reach deeply and to speak about the terror of racism in our midst, and to speak about having our hearts, if they're sanctified in Christ, cleansed of all of that division that sees us looking at a neighbor with suspicion. Who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? People will. People will. But may God use those experiences as a time and a place for the people of God to change. And may it be used as a witness that will bring change. And may we, in sanctifying our hearts for Christ, may we be able to make room within ourselves to be that change. And may God use it contagiously. Well, that's our passage for this coming Sunday. We pray for God's blessings to you as you continue to chew and brew on this passage. We look forward to moving together towards Sunday again. Thanks for listening.